Some of the largest stone beings ever created by humans were never meant to move, yet they were built to stand watch over empires, beliefs, warriors, and forgotten worlds. In this video, you'll see giant Buddhas hidden in forests, stone warriors older than Rome, winged beasts guarding burned capitals, and faces carved so heavy the earth itself had to carry their memory. These are not legends. These are the monuments that refuse to disappear. Watch till the end, and subscribe now for 7 years of luck and ancient power in your feed. The Great Buddha of Leshan, China. On the rugged cliffs of southwestern China, where the Min River, Dadu River, and Qingyi River collide in violent seasonal currents, a human figure watches silently over the waters. It is not a living guardian, but a mountain transformed into a body, a cliff reshaped into a face, and stone carved into spiritual presence. This is the Leshan giant Buddha, the largest stone Buddha statue in the world, and one of the most ambitious acts of devotional engineering ever attempted by human hands. The Buddha stands 71 meters tall, its shoulders as wide as a city street, its feet large enough to seat more than 100 people. From the river below, the statue does not appear built. It appears discovered, as if the mountain itself had always intended to take this shape. Yet every curve of the face, every fold of the robe, and every strand of hair was carved by thousands of workers over nearly 90 years of uninterrupted labour during the Tang dynasty. This project began in the early 8th century under the direction of a Buddhist monk named Haitong, who believed the dangerous river junction below the cliffs was killing too many boats, too many traders, and too many families. Haitong did not plan a bridge or a wall. Instead, he believed that divine presence itself could calm the waters. He envisioned a colossal Buddha carved directly into the living rock, positioned to face the triple river convergence and spiritually restrain the violence of nature. At the time, river trade was the economic lifeline of Sichuan. Grain, salt, timber, and silk moved through these vast waters. But the currents where the rivers met were unpredictable and fatal. Haitong's solution was faith combined with engineering. When he could not convince local officials to fund the project, he raised money himself through donations. When corrupt authorities tried to seize those funds, legend says Haitong gouged out his own eyes to prove that the money belonged to the Buddha alone. Whether literal or symbolic, the story reflects the depth of commitment behind the project. Work began around 713 CE. Teams of labourers, stonemasons, scaffold builders, and water engineers attacked the sheer cliff face with iron tools, chiselling downward from the top rather than upward from the base. This method was deliberate. By carving from above, falling debris could be directed into the river in controlled ways. Over time, those tons of displaced stone altered the riverbed itself, reducing whirlpools and lowering the ferocity of the current. In that sense, the Buddha did not only symbolically calm the waters, it physically reshaped them. The statue's head alone is 15 meters tall. Each ear stretches 7 meters. The hair consists of 1,000 tightly coiled stone nodules designed to channel rainwater away from the face. Hidden drainage systems run through the head, shoulders, arms, and back, engineering channels that prevent water accumulation and erosion. These internal systems are so precise that after 13 centuries of monsoon rain, the statue still stands without structural failure. This was not only religious sculpture, this was hydrological architecture hidden inside sacred art. The face of the Buddha is intentionally serene, the eyes are half closed, the mouth rests in a subtle line, neither smiling nor stern. The posture reflects the traditional Maitreya form, representing calm authority rather than suffering or ascetic withdrawal. This Buddha does not warn, it stabilizes. It does not dominate, it observes. From its vantage point, it overlooks the rivers below exactly as intended, fulfilling both spiritual and environmental purpose. The statue was not completed in Haitong's lifetime. After his death, work halted due to financial and political instability. Decades later, new patrons resumed construction, understanding the project not simply as a religious monument, but as civic infrastructure. When it was finally completed in 803 CE, nearly 3 generations of workers had shaped it. The Buddha became both a sacred presence and a silent engineer holding the rivers in balance. Around the Buddha, temples were built. Pilgrims arrived by river. Rituals were performed at the foot of the statue. Offerings were placed below the massive feet. Over centuries, the site became known not only as a place of worship, but as an access point linking religion, trade, and landscape control. The Buddha did not replace nature, it integrated with it. What makes the Leshan Buddha distinct from other colossal statues is its fusion of geology and anatomy. The cliff was not merely carved, its fractures, layers, and stability were studied. The artisans adapted the Buddha's form to the rock's natural strengths and weaknesses. The robe folds follow sediment lines. The shoulders align with load-bearing strata. The Buddha is inseparable from the mountain because it was engineered as part of the mountain. In later centuries, earthquakes, wars, dynastic collapses and floods ravaged Sichuan. Empires rose and fell around the statue. Entire cities vanished. Yet the Buddha remained, absorbing moisture, shedding water through its internal drains, and maintaining its posture while human history reassembled itself again and again below. During the 20th century, the rivers once again rose dangerously due to deforestation and industrial activity. For a brief time, floodwaters reached the Buddha's toes, triggering widespread fear that the statue itself might be damaged. Emergency conservation efforts stabilized the surrounding terrain, and advanced survey systems confirmed that the ancient drainage network still functioned exactly as its Tang Dynasty engineers designed it. Modern visitors often assume that such a statue must have been intended purely as religious propaganda, but the evidence suggests something more complex. The Leshan Buddha reflects a civilization that did not separate faith, engineering, and environmental control. The Buddha is devotion, infrastructure, hydrology, and political authority compressed into one single form. The stillness of the face hides immense technical calculation. Each cubic meter of stone removed required transport, disposal, and stabilization planning. Each rain handling channel required slope control, volume prediction, and long-term erosion modeling. None of this was written down in surviving manuals. It lived in applied knowledge, passed from master to apprentice, sustained over nearly a century of labour continuity. Standing on a boat today, beneath the Buddha's feet, the scale overwhelms human perspective. You no longer perceive it as sculpture, you perceive it as geography. The distinction between nature and artifact dissolves. The Buddha becomes a mountain that learned how to look back at the people below. For 13 centuries, floods have come and gone, dynasties have collapsed, empires have shifted borders, languages have changed, but the Buddha still watches the river junction, not as a relic of belief, but as a working solution to a problem that once threatened all life moving through this valley. The great Buddha of Leshan is not a symbol of dominance over nature, it is a symbol of alignment with nature through spiritual intention, reinforced by engineering precision. It represents a moment in human history when belief was not separated from environmental responsibility, and when spiritual monuments were designed not only to inspire awe, but to stabilize the physical world. This statue is not just seen, it is lived with. The rivers still respect its presence, the mountain still carries its weight, and human beings, after 13 centuries, still gather at its feet, not because they were told to, but because something about its scale, silence, and endurance continues to speak without words. The giant rock-cut elephants of Mahabalipuram is India. Along the southeastern coast of India, where the Bay of Bengal presses endlessly against ancient granite outcrops, lies the stone-built port city of Mahabalipuram. Today it is known for its shore temples and carved caves, but more than 13 centuries ago it was a thriving maritime centre of an empire that linked inland kingdoms with ocean trade routes stretching across Southeast Asia. Among its many monuments, a group of life-size rock-cut stone elephants, carved directly from living bedrock, lie scattered in quiet dignity near the temple complexes. They are not statues placed later by hands. They are mountains reshaped into animals. Each elephant was carved as part of the natural granite boulders that emerged from the coastal plateau. The sculptors did not extract stone and build upward. They worked directly into the outcrops, removing material until form emerged from mass. In this method, destruction and creation were the same act. The elephants were not added to the landscape, they were revealed from it. Mahabalipuram flourished during the reign of the Pallava dynasty in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, especially under King Narasimhavarman IV. This was a period when South Indian art shifted from brick and timber architecture into fully carved stone monuments. Temples were no longer assembled, they were excavated. The elephants belonged to the same stone-cut revolution that produced the famous monolithic chariot temples known as the Five Rathas. But unlike religious icons carved strictly for worship, these elephants exist in a different visual language. They are not divine beings, they are animals of the earth, presented with weight, breath, tension, and rest. One elephant lies as though it has knelt after a long march. Another stands with its trunk lowered and its head slightly turned. The sculptors captured not only anatomy but behaviour. Muscles are taut beneath the skin. The folds of flesh hang where gravity would place them. The eyes are calm, not stylized. These are not symbolic elephants. They feel observed from life. This realism is what separates Mahabalipuram's elephants from most sculptural traditions of the ancient world. Many civilizations idealized animals. These sculptors studied them. To carve these elephants required an advanced understanding of stone behavior. Granite fractures unpredictably. One miscalculated strike could destroy months of work. The artisans began by roughing out massive forms, removing vast volumes of rock with hammerstones. They then refined surface planes using abrasives, slowly softening edges until the illusion of living flesh appeared. The elephants were originally part of ritual and architectural theatre. They flanked temple approaches, guarded sacred pathways, and framed the experience of moving through stone space into divine interiors. In South Indian cosmology, the elephant is not merely an animal, it is power under control, it is memory, it is sacred burden-bearing strength. Elephants also defined empire. War elephants moved armies. Temple elephants moved deities. Royal processions moved through cities on elephant back. To carve elephants into living stone was to immortalize royal power, religious authority, and civic identity in a form that could not be dismantled. Unlike freestanding statues, these elephants could never be relocated. Their immobility made them permanent witnesses. They were carved to stay where the land itself had formed them. Mahabalipuram was also a port of global reach. Traders from Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and beyond docked here. Religious ideas crossed with goods. Hinduism travelled outward from this coast, while artistic ideas flowed back inward. The elephants became part of a visual language that later spread across South and Southeast Asia in stone and bronze. Yet the elephants also had a second life in natural history. Over centuries, sea winds eroded their flanks, salt mist weathered their surfaces, monsoon rains reshaped their edges. Unlike indoor statues, these figures lived and aged with the climate. In the 1960s, a massive tsunami struck the Mahabalipuram coast. For generations, locals had spoken of submerged stone figures beneath the sea. When the water receded, underwater ruins briefly emerged along the shoreline. Granite structures, walls, and sculpture fragments appeared, confirming that the ancient complex was once far larger than what survived on land. The elephants suddenly felt less isolated. They were part of a drowned cityscape. Despite this erosion and flooding, the elephants endure. Their survival is not accidental. Granite is one of the most durable natural materials available. The Pallava builders selected it intentionally, knowing that perishable materials would not preserve cultural memory across centuries. What is most striking when standing beside these elephants today is their silence. They do not dominate the space like temples. They rest within it. Children climb across their backs. Visitors sit beside their legs, unaware of the technological mastery beneath the calm surfaces. But the scale becomes clear when you stand at eye level. These are not decorative carvings. These are full-bodied mega-sculptures shaped from bedrock that previously formed part of a coastal plateau. Every inch required deliberate removal. Every curve required irreversible commitment. No inscriptions explain who carved them. No records describe their ceremonial purpose clearly. No texts explain whether they were symbolic guardians, royal emblems, or devotional offerings. Their meaning exists in stone rather than language. The elephants also reflect how ancient India understood scale. Instead of overpowering humans with fear, these sculptures humanize power. The elephants are large, but they feel approachable. Their mass is balanced by calm posture. Their strength is quiet. This balance mirrors the philosophy unfolding in South India during the early medieval period, where spiritual authority aimed to harmonize with natural order rather than impose upon it. Temples emerged from mountains, animals emerged from rock. Architecture did not replace nature, it collaborated with it. In Mahabalipuram, this philosophy is carved into the ground itself. The elephants are not surface decoration, they are geology reshaped into story. Modern conservationists face a slow battle against time. Salt crystallization weakens outer layers. Repeated touch smooths fine details. Rising sea levels threaten foundations. Laser surveys now monitor microscopic shifts in stone density. Technology now guards what ancient hands once shaped. But preservation alone cannot restore what these elephants originally represented within a fully active temple city. They were never meant to stand isolated in open tourism. They were meant to anchor ritual movement through space, guiding bodies from the human world toward carved divine interiors. Even now, they continue that role quietly. Visitors approach temples by passing beside them. Movement still follows the pathway shaped by ancient design. Without knowing it, modern footsteps still trace sacred roots carved more than 1,000 years ago. The giant rock-cut elephants of Mahabalipuram do not tell us stories through inscriptions. They tell us stories through posture, scale, and survival. They show a moment in human history when belief, imperial power, artistic observation, and geological mastery converged into single frozen gestures. They were not placed as symbols to be interpreted through text. They were carved as lived presences meant to endure alongside wind, ocean, and generations of human eyes. And after 13 centuries of salt, storm, invasion, trade, worship, forgetting, and rediscovery, they still stand where the mountain once stood, carrying the memory of hands that reshaped the earth not to conquer it, but to speak through it. The giant stone faces of Bayon Temple, Cambodia, at the silent centre of the ancient walled city of Angkor Thom, surrounded by laterite walls, wide ceremonial roads, and towering gates carved with gods and demons, rises the most enigmatic temple ever built by the Khmer civilization, the Bayon Temple. From its upper towers, more than 200 massive stone faces look outward in every direction, smiling gently across the jungle canopy, across ruined streets, and across 8 centuries of silence. No other monument on earth presents power in such a quiet, watchful form. The faces are carved into 54 towers, originally crowned with even more before collapse and erosion reduced their number. Each face is nearly 7 meters tall. The eyes are heavy-lidded. The lips curve gently upward, forming an expression that has puzzled historians for generations. It is not the grin of conquest. It is not the severity of judgment. It is something in between, calm, distant, and endlessly observing. Bayon was constructed in the late 12th and early 13th centuries during the reign of Jayavarman VII, one of the most powerful rulers Southeast Asia ever produced. Unlike earlier Khmer kings who emphasized Hindu deities, Jayavarman VII embraced Mahayana Buddhism, reshaping the spiritual identity of the empire. Bayon became his state temple, placed deliberately at the exact centre of Angkor Thom, as if the city itself were arranged around this silent core of watching faces. The identity of the faces has never been fully resolved. Many scholars believe they represent the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, the embodiment of mercy watching over the world in all directions. Others argue that the faces carry the likeness of Jayavarman VII himself, merging king and deity into a single form of sacred rulership. In this interpretation, the faces become the gaze of the empire made permanent in stone, the king watching his city forever from every horizon. What makes the Bayon faces extraordinary is not only their number or size, but their complete integration with architecture. They are not added onto the towers as decoration, they are the towers. Each tower rises upward as a shaft of stacked stone blocks, and at its summit the faces emerge seamlessly from the structure as if the building itself has become conscious and begun to look outward. The stone used for Bayon is sandstone quarried from the Kulin Mountains far to the northeast. Each block was transported along canals using barges, then lifted into place with ramp systems and coordinated labour. Tens of thousands of workers would have been required to raise the temple over time. Every face was carved in situ after the tower had been built, meaning sculptors worked at extreme heights, suspended above the city, shaping the features only after the stone had become part of the structure. The expression of the faces is deliberate. The eyes do not confront. They hover. The eyelids droop slightly, as if the gaze passes through rather than locks onto the viewer. The smile is restrained, controlled, uncertain. It suggests awareness without interference. This subtle emotional ambiguity is what has given Bayon its haunting power. Visitors do not feel judged, they feel observed. During Jayavarman VII's reign, the Khmer Empire expanded rapidly. Roads, hospitals, rest houses, bridges and reservoirs were constructed across vast territory. Bayon was not simply a place of prayer, it was a central instrument of political theology. By uniting the image of compassion with the imagery of kingship, the temple communicated a new model of power, not only the king who conquers, but the king who watches, protects, and sustains. Surrounding Bayon's inner sanctuary is a vast gallery of bas-reliefs carved directly into stone walls. These reliefs depict battles against the Cham invaders, riverine warfare, naval combat, marketplaces, cooking fires, festivals, cockfights, childbirth, and everyday village life. Unlike the remote cosmic narratives of earlier Khmer temples, Bayon's reliefs show social reality. It is one of the most complete visual records of daily life in the medieval Khmer world, and above all of it, the faces look on. They see war, they see trade, they see worship, they see collapse, they see rebuilding, they see the emptying of the city after Angkor's decline, they see the jungle reclaiming roads and rooftops, they see European explorers arriving centuries later, stunned by the scale of what had been abandoned. After the fall of Angkor in the 15th century, Bayon was partially modified to incorporate Theravada Buddhist practices. The internal shrine was altered, some divine images were removed, offerings shifted from royal ceremonies to monastic devotion, but the faces remained untouched. No later generation tried to erase them. Even conquerors left them intact. This survival is remarkable given the religious shifts of the region. Hinduism gave way to Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana gave way to Theravada. Political dynasties rose and vanished, yet the faces endured through every transition, accepted by every belief system as something too fundamental to remove. Structurally, Bayon is a complex puzzle. Unlike the strict axial symmetry of Angkor Wat, Bayon's layout is disordered, layered, and evolving. It was built, modified, expanded, dismantled, and rebuilt repeatedly during Jayavarman VII's reign. Towers were added where space allowed. Galleries were reconfigured around existing structures. No two-faced towers are exactly identical. This irregularity gives Bayon its organic, almost breathing character. From ground level, visitors experience the faces suddenly. They appear between narrow passages. They emerge above collapsed stairways. They reveal themselves slowly through shifting angles of ruins and tree roots. There is no single reveal. The temple unfolds through movement. From above, the faced towers form a stone forest of watching minds. Every direction is covered. North, south, east, and west are equally observed. The city had no blind side. The symbolism is unmistakable. In a world without surveillance devices, without written mass communication, the ruler made his presence omnipresent through architecture. The faces did not threaten punishment. They established awareness. They told the population that power was distributed everywhere, not located solely in a throne room. Over time, erosion softened facial lines. Storm water carved shallow channels across cheeks. Lichen settled into eye sockets. Roots pushed through joints. Yet even softened, the expressions remain intact. The corners of the mouth still curve. The eyelids still hover. The gaze still holds. Archaeologists studying Bayonne have never found any inscription definitively identifying the faces. This ambiguity may be intentional. By merging king, bodhisattva, and cosmic observer into a single stone presence, Bayonne avoids fixed identity. It becomes adaptable across belief systems. The same face can be read as divine compassion, royal authority, or ancestral guardianship. Standing beneath a face tower today, one becomes aware of scale in an unusual way. You are not dwarfed by aggressive height as in pyramids. You are enveloped by proximity. The face does not loom. It leans forward gently. It exists within your personal space. This sensory experience is what made Bayonne so powerful in its time. Worshippers did not confront distant gods. They stood beneath watching presences embedded in the city itself. The sacred was not above the world. It was interwoven through daily movement. The giant stone faces of Bayonne Temple represent one of the most radical experiments in political and spiritual architecture ever attempted. Instead of building a monument that towered over people, the Khmers built a city that looked back at its inhabitants from every horizon. The faces did not enforce obedience through fear. They shaped behaviour through awareness. After 8 centuries, the city is silent. The empire is gone. The roads lead only to forest, but the faces remain at their posts. They still watch the sunrise over Angkor Thom. They still watch the rain settle into the stone courtyards. They still watch visitors pass through the gates unaware of how closely history continues to observe them. And perhaps that is why Bayonne feels different from every other ruin on Earth. Most ruins are empty. Bayonne is still occupied, not by people, but by presence. The giant rock Buddha of Bingling Sea, China, along a narrow stretch of the Yellow River where steep cliffs rise directly from slow, sediment-heavy water, stands one of the most quietly overwhelming achievements of Buddhist rock-cut architecture in East Asia, the Bingling Sea Grottos. Carved into a remote canyon wall in today's Gansu, the site is inaccessible by road for much of the year and is still reached primarily by boat. From the river, the cliff face appears almost empty until the light shifts and the outlines of seated figures begin to emerge from the stone. At the centre of this hidden sanctuary sits the giant rock Buddha of Bingling Sea, a colossal figure whose head alone is larger than a city bus, gazing across a landscape that has changed very little since the statue first took form more than 14 centuries ago. Bingling Sea is not a single monument, but a complete spiritual landscape carved into stone. More than 180 caves and niches puncture the sandstone cliffs, filled with thousands of statues, murals and inscriptions. Together they represent over 1,000 years of continued religious devotion, expansion and renewal. Yet among this immense assembly of sacred spaces, one figure dominates both visually and symbolically. The great seated Buddha, carved high above the river, its scale demanding attention without aggression, its presence asserting calm rather than power. The statue was begun during the Western Qin period in the early 5th century and expanded during the Northern Wei, Western Wei and Tang dynasties. Unlike many other cave temple complexes that were executed within relatively short historical windows, Bingling Sea evolved over centuries. Each dynasty inherited what the last had begun and continued carving into the same living cliff. The giant Buddha belongs to this long continuum, shaped by multiple generations who shared the same intent but worked with different tools, styles, and political realities. The Buddha is carved directly from the cliff itself, not assembled from blocks, not attached as a separate structure. The mountain is the statue. The torso, knees, shoulders, and head all emerge from a single mass of sandstone. The seated posture follows the traditional meditation pose, with hands originally positioned in a gesture of teaching and reassurance. While erosion has softened surface details over time, the essential geometry of the body remains intact, anchored permanently to the canyon wall. From the river below, the Buddha first appears as an abstract shape, a suggestion of symmetry in the rock. As the boat approaches, form resolves into anatomy. The shoulders widen, the chest deepens, the head begins to dominate the composition. By the time the vessel draws directly beneath the statue, the full scale becomes impossible to measure by instinct alone. The head alone dwarfs human proportion, yet the expression remains serene, intimate even, as if scale were not the primary language being spoken. The facial features follow the conventions of early Chinese Buddhist sculpture, influenced by Central Asian and Indian prototypes. The eyes are elongated and heavy-lidded, the nose is full and straight, the lips curve gently in a restrained expression of inward calm. The hair is arranged in carved nodules that once held traces of pigment. This was not bare stone in its original state. Like most early Buddhist sculptures in China, the Binglingsi Buddha was once painted in vivid mineral colours that would have made it visible from far down the river. Colour at Binglingsi served not as decoration but as narrative language. Reds indicated sacred vitality, blues marked transcendence. Gold leaf was applied selectively to signify the divine body. Over centuries, floods, wind abrasion, and chemical weathering stripped most of this colour away, leaving behind a raw stone surface. Yet even unpainted, the statue still carries the memory of its intended visual power. The selection of this cliff as a sacred site was not random. In Chinese Buddhist cosmology, rivers represent both impermanence and continuity. They erase while they sustain. By placing a colossal seated Buddha directly above a major river corridor, the builders created a visual axis between movement and stillness, between trade and meditation, between worldly circulation and spiritual pause. Boaters passing beneath the statue would encounter the Buddha not as a destination, but as an interruption to motion itself, a reminder to momentarily step outside the current of survival and attention. Binglingsi's location also placed it on a cultural frontier. Gansu was one of the primary corridors of the Silk Road, where merchants, monks, diplomats, and armies moved between China, Central Asia, and beyond. The artistic style of the site reflects this traffic. Elements of Gandharan naturalism mix with Northern Way abstraction. Indian iconographic rules combine with Chinese stoneworking traditions. The giant Buddha, therefore, is not just a religious image, it is a geological imprint of cultural exchange frozen into the canyon wall. The engineering behind the statue is subtle but formidable. Sandstone is softer than granite or basalt, making it easier to carve but also more vulnerable to erosion and fracture. The carvers needed to understand load distribution across the remaining stone mass. They did not hollow the statue fully from behind. Instead, they left deep supporting material within the cliff to bear compressive stress. The shoulder planes align with vertical fracture patterns in the rock, minimizing shear risk. Drainage grooves were cut along natural water paths to divert rain away from critical facial and chest surfaces. Scaffolding for the original carving would have been suspended from the top of the cliff using timber beams anchored into drilled sockets. Workers chiselled downward layer by layer, constantly assessing the stone's response. Any major structural crack could have meant abandoning the attempt entirely. The statue's survival across 14 centuries indicates that those original risk calculations were unusually accurate. Unlike cave Buddhas intended for enclosed ritual interiors, the Binglingsi giant was carved for open-air presence. It did not belong to monks alone. It belonged to the river, to workers towing boats upstream, to families crossing between valleys, to refugees and soldiers passing through uncertain landscapes. It functioned less as an object of doctrinal teaching and more as a fixed axis of meaning within a volatile environment. Over centuries, the political regimes that sponsored Binglingsi changed repeatedly. Dynasties rose and fell, Buddhism flourished, declined, and revived. Yet the cliff sanctuary remained active far longer than most religious centres. New niches were added beside old ones. New mural layers were painted over earlier compositions. The giant Buddha remained a central constant, anchoring the evolving spiritual identity of the site. During times of persecution, especially in the Tang dynasty's later anti-Buddhist campaigns, many grottos across China were defaced or sealed. Binglingsi's remote location spared it from widespread destruction. Being difficult to reach saved it. Geography became its protection. In the modern era, the construction of upstream dams altered water levels along the Yellow River, causing partial submergence of lower caves during certain seasons. Conservation teams were forced to document statues quickly before rising waters covered access points. The giant Buddha, elevated high above the flood zone, became both witness and survivor once again, outlasting another transformation of the river beneath it. Close examination of the statue's surface reveals tool marks still preserved in sheltered areas. Parallel chisel grooves trace the direction of the original carving strokes. In some places you can still read the rhythm of labour in the stone. Short strikes for contour modelling, long scrapes for surface levelling. These marks are the handwriting of anonymous craftsmen who never signed their names, whose biographies were erased by time, yet whose decisions still guide the behaviour of wind and rain across the statue's surface. The scale of the giant Buddha was not driven solely by ambition. In Buddhist thought, scale communicates metaphysical distance. A colossal figure does not represent physical largeness alone. It represents the boundlessness of awakened awareness. When early pilgrims encountered the Binglingsi Buddha from the river, they did not experience it simply as an artwork. They experienced it as an encounter with immeasurable presence anchored into the physical world. The caves surrounding the giant were active ritual spaces. Monks recited sutras inside flickering chambers. Donors had names carved beside small devotional figures. Incense smoke darkened ceilings. Mural cycles illustrated cosmological realms and legendary tales of Buddhist compassion. The giant Buddha presided over this invisible activity from outside, unentered and untouchable, embodying the outermost layer of the sacred environment. In periods of abandonment, when monks left and offerings ceased, the canyon did not feel empty. The Buddha remained. Its stillness preserved the idea that the site awaited return. When later generations rediscovered or reoccupied Binglingsi, they did not need to re-establish meaning. It was already watching. Standing at water level today, the viewer experiences an unusual distortion of scale. The cliff compresses horizontal distance. The river flattens vertical perception. The Buddha seems closer than it truly is, then suddenly unreachable as the eye tries to focus on details dozens of meters above natural ground level. This perceptual shifting was not accidental. It is what makes the encounter feel unstable, quietly disorienting, and therefore memorable. The giant rock Buddha of Binglingsi was never meant to dominate an urban skyline or a formal plaza. It was meant to occupy wild space, transitional space, vulnerable space. The river could not be controlled permanently. The canyon could not be tamed. Yet the statue inserts calm into that instability without attempting to conquer it. This is the essential difference between many monumental traditions. Some monuments impose order, others negotiate with uncertainty. Binglingsi belongs entirely to the second category. It does not shout power. It does not enforce alignment. It remains simply and consistently present, and in doing so, it transforms a narrow stretch of river and cliff into one of the longest standing spiritual observation points in East Asian history. The giant rock Buddha of Binglingsi is not a monument to a ruler. It is not a commemoration of conquest. It is a monolith of patience, carved across generations, weathered across dynasties, and endured across every human attempt to redefine permanence. Even now, as boats pass below and water levels shift with modern engineering, the Buddha remains exactly where it was intended to be placed thousands of chisel strokes ago, watching movement without participating in it, anchoring impermanence to stone. The giant rock-cut lion of Sigiriya, Sri Lanka. Rising suddenly from the forests of central Sri Lanka, a sheer column of red volcanic stone dominates the horizon like a halted wave of earth frozen in mid-motion. This is Sigiriya, a natural monolith transformed into a royal capital in the 5th century CE, and at its heart once stood one of the most extraordinary architectural symbols of power ever carved from living rock, a gigantic stone lion, its open jaws forming the primary gateway into a hidden palace complex suspended nearly 200 metres above the surrounding plains. Today only the enormous brick and stone paws remain at the base of the final ascent, but in its full form the lion once rose complete, head, body and forelegs sculpted directly around the natural contours of the rock, forcing every visitor to enter the fortress by passing through the mouth of a constructed beast. The message was not subtle. To reach the king, you had to walk into the body of power itself. Sigiriya's transformation into a royal citadel is tied to the reign of Kashyapa IV, a ruler whose ascent to power was rooted in violence, betrayal, and fear. After overthrowing his father and driving his rightful heir into exile, Kashyapa chose not to rule from the traditional lowland capitals. Instead, he withdrew to this isolated rock, converting it into a self-contained city designed for surveillance, defence, and absolute control of access. The Lion Gateway became the symbolic and physical threshold to that world. The lion was not chosen at random. In South Asian political symbolism, the lion had long represented kingship, authority, and cosmic guardianship. It appears in Buddhist iconography, in ancient royal standards, and in the legends of island dynasties that trace their origins to lion ancestry. By shaping his palace entrance as a colossal lion, Kashyapa was embedding his rule within a much older ideological framework that equated kingship with predatory strength and divine sanction. The construction of Sigiriya required a level of coordinated labour rarely seen outside imperial capitals. The entire site functioned as an integrated system of hydraulics, fortification, rituals, pleasure gardens, surveillance routes, and ceremonial spaces. Water was channeled up the rock through stone-lined conduits. Fountains were engineered to function using underground pressure gradients that still operate during monsoon rains. Terraced gardens were geometrically aligned below the rock, merging natural symmetry with imposed order. At the midpoint of the ascent, beyond the lion's paws, lies the famous mirror wall, a polished plaster surface so finely finished that it once reflected the silhouettes of those who passed. Over centuries, visitors scratched poems and messages into this surface, creating one of the earliest known collections of informal public writing in South Asia. These inscriptions speak not of politics, but of longing, beauty, memory, and awe, at the painted figures that once decorated the rock's sheltered alcoves. Above this corridor, in hidden recesses cut into the sheer face of the stone, survived the Sigiriya frescoes, painted images of celestial women rendered with striking realism and softness. Their presence within a fortress speaks to a dual nature of the site, part military refuge, part pleasure palace, part symbolic stage where power expressed itself through art as well as stone. But it is the lion that defined the psychological journey upward. The original lion structure was constructed from brick and stucco wrapped around carved stone foundations. The head rose at the highest point of the gateway, while the forepaws extended outward to flank the staircase. The visitor would walk between the paws, climb through the chest cavity, and emerge inside the fortress complex. It was not merely an entrance, it was a ritual passage through a sculpted body. Archaeological analysis of surviving fragments suggests that the lion's head alone would have stood several meters tall, fully visible from the gardens below. Its mouth formed an arched portal, framed by carved teeth and jaws. Colour traces indicate it was once painted in bold mineral pigments, likely reds, whites, and blacks, making it vividly visible from great distance. The ascent toward the lion would have been a visual progression from landscape into symbol. The engineering behind this structure required a precise understanding of weight distribution and erosion control. Brick was chosen deliberately for the upper lion body because it allowed fine shaping without compromising the structural integrity of the rock beneath. The paws, however, were carved and faced with stone to withstand compressive forces from the staircases anchored into them. Even after the destruction of the upper lion body centuries later, the paws remained stable because of this careful division between load-bearing stone and form-giving brick. After Kashyap's death in battle, Sigiriya lost its role as a royal capital. The rightful dynasty returned to power and the fortress was partially abandoned. Over time, the complex was repurposed as a Buddhist monastery. Cells were carved into the rock. Meditation platforms were installed. The lion, however, lost its original political identity. Its head and body were eventually dismantled by time, reorganization and decay. Only the paws were left to frame the now reoriented stairway. Even in partial form, the lion's scale still alters perception. Standing between the paws today, the human body feels deliberately small. The stairway between them narrows vision upward. The sky becomes a vertical tunnel. The sense of walking into a constructed presence has not fully vanished, even after the lion itself has eroded away. Sigiriya's placement within the surrounding landscape was also intentional. The rock dominates the irrigation plains used by surrounding farming communities. From the summit, the king could observe movement across vast distance. From the plains, the rock appears inaccessible, unassailable, and omnipresent. The lion entrance amplified that effect by converting a geological outcrop into a visible political body. Water engineering at Sigiriya reinforces this symbolism. Symmetrical pools, underground conduits, pressure fountains, and axial gardens mirror earlier Persian and Indian cosmological garden designs, in which water represents order imposed on chaos. Every approach route to the lion moved through these gardens before meeting the vertical ascent. The visitor passed from water to stone, from open axis to vertical confinement, from reflective horizontality into narrow rising shadow. Unlike many fortresses that rely on walls and towers, Sigiriya relies on psychological architecture as much as physical defence. The ascent is exposed, the stairways cling to the rock face. The lion framed the point of no return. Once inside, retreat was as difficult as advance. The lion did not merely guard the entrance, it controlled decision. The loss of the upper lion body has often been described as destruction, but its disappearance also reveals something essential about Sigiriya. The site was never meant to be static. It evolved from quarry to palace to monastery to forgotten ruin and finally to archaeological monument. Each phase stripped and reinterpreted what remained. The lion's partial survival mirrors that layered human use. In modern Sri Lanka, the lion remains a national symbol of sovereignty. It appears on the national flag, on emblems, in folklore, and in state imagery. The broken lion of Sigiriya forms a direct visual genealogy of that identity, a connection not built through written lineage alone, but through stone memory embedded into landscape. Standing beneath the paws today, one does not feel the threat of a predator. One feels the intention of a ruler who wanted power to be entered physically before it could be challenged. The paws do not crush, they frame. The staircase between them becomes a corridor between ordinary ground and constructed authority. The giant, rock-cut lion of Sigiriya is therefore not simply a sculpture and not merely an entrance. It is an engineered psychological threshold where geology, kingship, symbolism, and human movement converge. It is the moment where natural mountain becomes royal body and where climbing becomes submission to scale. Above, the summit still holds foundations of palace rooms, cisterns, halls, and terraces open to the sky. Below, the gardens still catch rainwater exactly as their designers intended. Between them, the lion's paws remain at their post, silent but still directing how the human body approaches power. After more than 1500 years of storms, dynasties, monks, empires, colonial surveys, and modern tourism, the lion no longer roars, but it still stands exactly where kings once demanded it to stand, at the precise point where earth becomes authority and ascent becomes meaning. The giant stone camel of Dumat al-Jandal, Saudi Arabia. At the northern edge of the Arabian desert, where open sand plains meet broken sandstone ridges and rare oases determine the survival of entire regions, lies the ancient settlement of Dumat al-Jandal. For thousands of years, this oasis functioned as a critical stopping point on long-distance trade routes linking southern Arabia, Mesopotamia, and the eastern Mediterranean. Before roads, before engines, before borders, this place existed because of one single requirement for survival in the desert: water, and one single animal that made that survival possible: the camel. Carved directly into a vertical rock face near the outskirts of the ancient settlement is a life-size giant stone camel, sculpted not as a symbolic creature, but as a realistic portrait of the animal, exactly as it existed in the lived world of early Arabia. The body rises in shallow, three-dimensional relief from the cliff itself. The neck curves forward with weight and presence. The head is slightly raised. The legs stand grounded beneath the mass of the torso. The hump emerges naturally along the spine. There is no exaggeration, no mythic distortion, no religious ornamentation. It is simply a camel, frozen in stone. Unlike statues built for interior temples or royal courtyards, this camel stands in open desert terrain. There are no protective walls, no surrounding shrine, no inscriptions explaining its purpose. The cliff face itself becomes both the canvas and the setting. To encounter it today feels less like visiting a monument and more like discovering a memory embedded directly into the land. The carving is generally dated to the late pre-Islamic period, likely between the 1st centuries BCE and CE, although some scholars suggest it could be even older based on erosion patterns and stylistic comparison with early Arabian rock reliefs. At that time, Dumat al-Jandal stood on one of the most active caravan networks of the ancient world. Frankincense, myrrh, spices, textiles, metals, and precious stones crossed these routes. Entire economies depended on caravans that could survive weeks of open desert with no permanent water sources. Without camels, none of this movement was possible. To carve the camel into stone at this massive scale was therefore not a decorative act. It was a public declaration of the most important reality of desert life. This animal was not simply useful, it was existential. It carried food, water, people, weapons, trade, news, and survival itself across distances that no human body could endure alone. The technical execution of the carving shows deep knowledge of both animal anatomy and stone behaviour. Sandstone, while softer than granite, fractures easily when struck poorly. The sculptors first isolated the silhouette of the camel, chiselling away the surrounding rock to force the animal's body forward from the cliff. Once the mass was established, they refined muscle planes across the shoulders, neck, flank, and legs, using repetitive hammering rather than long cutting strokes. The surface was left textured rather than polished, matching the natural grain of the cliff and allowing wind erosion to soften the form gradually over centuries. There is no inscription associated with the camel, no name of a ruler, no tribal mark, no dedicatory text. This absence is significant. It suggests that the sculpture's meaning was completely self-evident to those who encountered it. It required no written explanation. The message was understood instantly by every person who travelled these routes. This is the animal that makes your life in the desert possible. Dumat al-Jandal itself was not a minor outpost. Ancient records describe it as a fortified city that shifted between Assyrian, Nabatean, Roman-era Arab, and later Islamic influence. The nearby fortress of Merid Castle still rises above the oasis as physical proof of how valuable this location was to regional powers. Control of the oasis meant control of water. Control of water meant control of caravan movement. Control of caravans meant political and economic leverage. The camel carving existed within this power landscape, but spoke from a different layer of society. Where fortresses represent state authority, the camel represents lived infrastructure. It reflects not only rulers and armies, but merchants, herders, travellers, and families who depended on camel caravans for daily survival and seasonal migration. In desert societies, animals are not viewed simply as tools. They are understood as extensions of environmental intelligence. The camel's ability to store fat and water, regulate body temperature, and travel extreme distances without sustenance turned it into a near-mythic being within Arabian cosmology. To carve that animal into immovable stone is to transform movement into permanence and survival into memory. The location of the camel suggests it once stood directly along a primary caravan approach into the oasis. Travellers would encounter it after long desert journeys, often exhausted, dehydrated, and uncertain of their position. Seeing the stone camel carved into the rock would have confirmed that water and settlement were close. It may have functioned as reassurance as much as symbol. Some archaeologists propose that the camel also served as a territorial marker, identifying land controlled or protected by a particular group. In that interpretation, the camel becomes not only a symbol of life, but a declaration of knowledge of desert wells, seasonal routes, migration patterns, and environmental timing that determined who survived and who did not. Unlike palace reliefs filled with narrative scenes, this carving stands alone. There are no hunters, no enemies, no gods carved beside it. Its isolation eliminates distraction. Its form dominates the encounter completely. At sunrise and sunset, low-angle light casts shadows along its flank that restore a powerful three-dimensional presence, making the camel appear to step out from the stone. Over centuries, wind and sand have softened its edges. Fine surface details have gradually faded. Rain has cut shallow channels along the neck and legs. But this weathering does not feel like damage. It feels like continuation. The desert that once required camels for survival continues to reshape the camel in stone. Recent satellite surveys have revealed that the Dumat al-Jandal camel is part of a much larger tradition of monumental rock art across northwestern Arabia. Massive lions, ibex, camels, and other animals carved directly into cliffs have been documented across Saudi Arabia. Many of these carvings are larger and older than anything previously identified in the region. This discovery has reshaped how archaeologists understand early Arabian societies. These were not small, purely nomadic groups leaving minimal traces. They shaped entire landscapes with animal imagery at monumental scale. What makes the Dumat al-Jandal camel stand out within this tradition is its clarity and isolation. It is not part of a crowded scene. It stands alone, fully readable, deliberately placed where movement through the landscape was guaranteed. During the Islamic period, the camel's meaning shifted silently. It was no longer associated with pre-Islamic belief systems, yet it was not destroyed. Instead, it was absorbed into the background of memory. People passed it without ceremonial interaction, but they did not remove it. This silent tolerance allowed it to survive while many other pre-Islamic monuments vanished under active destruction or slow reuse of stone. Standing before the stone camel today, one does not feel the authority of kings or the presence of deities. One feels dependency. The sculpture communicates how fragile human survival once was without this animal. It reminds the viewer that entire civilizations of Arabia were organized around the movement capacity of a single species. The giant stone camel of Dumat al-Jandal is therefore not a religious monument and not an imperial trophy. It is an infrastructural monument. It is a tribute to endurance, to movement, and to knowledge of desert survival carved into the rock that once threatened to erase human life entirely. It stands as one of the quietest yet most honest monuments of the ancient world, recording not conquest, not theology, but the simple truth that without the camel, the desert would have remained uninhabitable at scale. The colossal stone statues of Aksum, Ethiopia. In the northern highlands of Ethiopia, where rugged plateaus rise above deep valleys and ancient trade routes once carried gold, ivory and incense between Africa, Arabia and the Mediterranean world, stands the ruined capital of one of Africa's most powerful ancient kingdoms, Aksum. Scattered across a wide field near the heart of the old city lie enormous stone monuments that resemble towers, though they were never buildings and never meant to be entered. These are the colossal Aksumite stelae, single-piece stone obelisks carved from solid granite, some of them rising nearly 24 metres into the air and weighing more than 150 tons. At first glance, they feel like abstract pillars, but closer observation reveals a striking truth. Each stele is carved to resemble a multi-storey building. False doors, stacked windows, beam ends, and layered floors are all cut directly into the stone as precise architectural illusions. These were not random shapes. They were symbolic houses carved at impossible scale, meant not for the living, but for the dead. Aksum emerged as a major power between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, dominating Red Sea trade and maintaining diplomatic and commercial links with Rome, Persia, Arabia, and India. Long before European empires reached Africa, Aksum minted its own coins, built monumental cities, and adopted Christianity as a state religion. The stelae belong to the earlier phase of this history, when royal burial rituals were expressed through stone on a scale unmatched anywhere else in Africa. Each obelisk marked the underground tomb of an elite ruler or noble family. Beneath the stelae lie deep chambers cut into bedrock, accessed by long stairways and sealed passage systems. The towering stone above acted as a visible anchor between the world of the living and the world below. The taller the stele, the greater the authority of the person buried beneath it. Height became memory. The largest of all, known today as the Great Stele, originally stood about 24 metres tall. It was carved from a single piece of granite and decorated with 12 stories of false windows and doors. At some point in antiquity, likely during its original erection, the stele collapsed and shattered where it fell. Even in broken form, its fragments dominate the landscape like the remains of a fallen skyscraper from a forgotten age. The engineering behind these monoliths remains astonishing. Granite is one of the hardest natural stones to work. Aksumite builders quarried it from distant sources, shaped it using iron tools and hammerstones, transported it across uneven terrain without wheels or modern lifting devices, and then raised it upright with precision. One miscalculation would have meant catastrophic collapse. The broken Great Stele is physical proof of that risk. Smaller steles still stand upright today, including one that rises over 21 metres tall. Its surface remains sharply carved even after more than 15 centuries of exposure. The stacked architectural illusion continues from base to summit, with a symbolic doorway at the bottom that once aligned directly with the underground tomb passage. The stone tower above and the chamber below formed a single symbolic structure linking sky and earth. These monuments were not meant to be worshipped like gods. They were not political propaganda visible to distant enemies. They were funerary declarations intended for the local population. They told the living exactly who ruled them and who continued to dominate memory, even in death. In Aksumite belief, royal authority did not end at burial. It extended downward into stone and forward through generations. The stele field was once surrounded by ceremonial avenues, offering platforms and royal compounds. Processions would have moved between the monuments during funerary rituals. Offerings were placed, chants spoken, and elite memory embedded into the landscape permanently. Over time, the stele transformed the burial ground into a forest of stone buildings for the dead. The false windows carved into the monuments are not decorative. They echo the wooden architecture of Aksumite palaces that no longer survive above ground. Because wood decays, these stone illusions are some of the only surviving evidence of how elite structures once looked. The stelae therefore preserve not just burial memory, but architectural memory. As Aksum converted to Christianity in the 4th century CE under King Ezana, burial customs gradually changed. Crosses replaced architectural facades. Royal tombs became associated with churches and relic traditions. The era of giant stelae ended, but the field remained as a silent archive of pre-Christian royal ideology. In later centuries, legends grew around the ruins. Aksum became associated with the Ark of the Covenant, believed by Ethiopian tradition to be housed in Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion. While the Ark itself cannot be verified, the mythology reinforced Aksum's identity as a place where stone, kingship, and divine authority intersected. During the 20th century, one of the major stelae was removed by Italian occupying forces and transported to Rome as a war trophy. For decades it stood beside a modern street in Europe, a displaced monument severed from its burial context. In 2005, after long negotiations, the obelisk was returned to Ethiopia and re-erected in its original field. Its return was not simply an act of restitution, it was the restoration of a broken conversation between landscape and memory. Walking among the Aksum stelae today, the scale remains disorienting. These are not decorative ruins. They are vertical masses of dead weight shaped with millimetre precision. Their surfaces hold shadow differently across the day, giving the illusion that the false windows open and close with the movement of the sun. In rain, water runs down their carved facades, exactly as it would across real buildings. What sets Aksum apart from other monumental civilizations is that its stone towers were not temples, not palaces, and not war markers. They were houses for the dead, raised to the height of towers. The living city has mostly vanished. The dead city still stands. There are no detailed written records explaining exactly how the largest stelae were raised. No diagrams survive. The knowledge existed in practiced skill, not in preserved text. That silence is part of what makes the accomplishment feel so distant. We see the result, but not the method. The Aksumite Empire eventually declined as trade routes shifted and regional powers rose, but the stelae remained. They were too large to remove and too sacred to repurpose easily. The earth shifted around them. Soil buried parts of the tombs. Grass crept into the burial courtyards. But the towers themselves continued to define the skyline. Even today, modern Aksum is built around the ancient field. Daily life moves beside monuments that represent a civilization more than 1,500 years removed. Children play among towers built for kings. Markets operate within sight of royal tombs. The boundary between past and present never fully closed here. The colossal stone statues of Aksum stand as one of the most extraordinary expressions of funerary architecture anywhere on Earth. They show a society that chose to make memory vertical, to translate authority into height, and to carve the idea of permanence into the hardest material available to them. They also remind us that Africa's ancient civilizations did not exist at the margins of the ancient world. Aksum stood at its commercial, political, and cultural crossroads. Its stone towers rose at the same time as Roman basilicas, Persian palaces, and early Chinese imperial monuments. Yet none of those cultures raised single-piece tomb markers at this scale, with this architectural illusion carved directly into the stone. In this, Aksum remains entirely its own. Even fractured, even weathered, even partially fallen, the stelae still perform their original function. They continue to announce that someone of great significance lies beneath the ground. They continue to convert empty air into memory through vertical stone. And in the quiet of the Ethiopian highlands, with wind moving through grass and sunlight shifting across carved windows that never opened, the city of the dead still stands taller than the living. The giant rock-cut horse of Chabahar, Iran. Along the remote southeastern coast of Iran, where the arid highlands of the Iranian plateau collapse suddenly into the salt air of the Arabian Sea, lies the port region of Chabahar. This is a landscape shaped by wind, tides, and rock erosion rather than agriculture or permanent rivers, a place where survival has always depended on movement rather than settlement. Carved into one of its weather-beaten coastal cliffs survives a little-known but deeply unusual monument, a giant rock-cut horse shaped directly from the living stone as if the animal itself were emerging from the edge of the earth. The horse is not a freestanding statue. It is a relief carved into the cliff face using the natural vertical surface as its background and structural support. The outline of the head, neck, chest, and forelegs is clearly defined, while the hindquarters fade gradually back into the rock, giving the impression of forward motion captured mid-stride. The proportions are near life-size or larger, with an extended neck, raised head, and muscular chest modelled with surprising anatomical awareness. This is not a symbolic outline, it is a studied animal form. Unlike imperial reliefs placed along royal highways or carved into palace facades, the Chabahar horse exists in isolation. There are no companion figures, no inscriptions, no surrounding narrative scenes. The cliff looks empty until the eye adjusts to the contours, and then the animal appears slowly out of shadow and stone. Its visibility depends entirely on light angle. At dawn and sunset, the figure becomes unmistakable. At midday, it nearly disappears again into the cliff. Dating the carving remains difficult. Weathering is extensive, and there are no associated structures to anchor it to a known cultural horizon with certainty. Based on stylistic comparison with early Iranian rock relief traditions and the known history of coastal routes along the Makran coast, archaeologists tentatively place the carving somewhere between the late 1st millennium BCE and the early 1st millennium CE. This was a time when the Iranian world was shaped by successive empires, Achaemenid, Seleucid, Parthian, and Sasanian, all of which relied heavily on horse culture for communication, warfare, and governance. In Iranian civilization, the horse was far more than a tool of travel. It was a measure of status, a weapon of conquest, a symbol of royal charisma, and a carrier of cultural memory. Epic literature, funerary traditions, and royal iconography across Persia consistently associate horses with legitimacy and divine favour. By carving a horse directly into coastal rock, the creators of the Chabahar relief projected that same central cultural symbol into a maritime frontier landscape that normally belonged more to boats than to riders. The technical method used to carve the horse reflects a careful balance between force and restraint. Coastal sedimentary rock fractures unpredictably, strike too hard, and the entire surface can shear away. Cut too shallow, and the form never resolves from the background. The sculptors removed stone selectively, isolating the animal's silhouette first, then carving inward along muscle planes to create depth where the neck meets the chest and where the forelegs separate. The surface was left deliberately rough in places, allowing natural erosion to complete the modelling over centuries. No pigment has survived on the relief, but it is likely that the horse was once painted. Across the ancient Iranian world, rock reliefs were originally coloured using mineral pigments that bonded well with stone, but faded with wind, rain, and salt over long periods. If the Chabahar horse once carried red, black, or ochre tones, it would have been visible from great distance along the coast, especially from the sea. This possibility raises the question of audience. The location of the carving suggests that it may have been intended not only for travellers on land, but also for sailors approaching the shoreline. In this interpretation, the horse becomes a coastal marker rather than simply a local monument, a sign that one was entering a known territory governed by a culture that identified power with mounted movement rather than maritime force alone. Chabahar's position reinforces this idea. It sits at the threshold between the Iranian plateau, the Indian Ocean trade world, and the desert routes leading into Central Asia. From here, goods moved between Arabia, the Indus region, and inland Persia. The horse relief may therefore represent the inland world announcing itself to the coast, a declaration that even at the edge of the sea, the power of the land-based empires remained present. Unlike lions or divine figures often used in imperial reliefs, the horse carries a different symbolic tone. It is not a predator. It is not an object of worship. It is movement itself made visible. To carve a horse into immovable rock is to freeze speed into permanence, to trap kinetic energy inside geological time. This paradox is what gives the Chabahar horse its quiet psychological force. It does not intimidate the viewer with violence or size. It unsettles by contradiction. A creature built for motion is fixed forever at the edge of the sea. A symbol of travel is locked into stone. The isolation of the relief deepens this effect. There is no surrounding architecture to explain it, no road alignment that defines its role, no written record to anchor its meaning. It stands outside formal history, operating instead as a direct transmission of intent between unknown carvers and modern observers, separated by 2,000 years of erasure. Some researchers have suggested that the carving may mark a caravan approach route that once descended from the highlands toward the coast. Others argue it may have stood near a now eroded anchorage point where inland and maritime trade systems intersected. Both interpretations agree on one point. The horse existed within a system of movement, not a system of static settlement. In Iranian cultural memory, movement has always been political. Control of roads meant control of goods. Control of mounted mobility meant control of intelligence, taxation, and military reach. The horse relief therefore encodes not only an animal, but a strategy, the projection of inland power outward toward fluid coastal space. Over centuries, the relief endured as empires changed hands. Parthian authority faded into Sasanian governance. Sasanian dominance collapsed under early Islamic expansion. Ports shifted. Trade currents reorganized. Yet the horse remained, not because it was defended, but because it was irrelevant to immediate control. It did not offer material resource for reuse. It could not be easily destroyed or repurposed. It simply existed. The survival of the Chabahar horse through religious and political transformation is significant. Many pre-Islamic figural monuments across Iran were deliberately erased or defaced as belief systems shifted. The horse, however, escaped systematic destruction, likely because of its remote position and its ambiguous identity. It is an animal, not a god. It is power without theology. Weather has taken its slow toll. Salt carried inland by coastal winds crystallizes in surface pores, breaking fine edges. Occasional monsoon rain accelerates erosion along natural fracture lines. The lower portions of the relief are more heavily worn than the upper head and neck, but the animal remains legible. Its posture is still readable. Its forward tension still registers in silhouette. Standing before the relief today, one feels no sense of ceremonial enclosure. There is no ritual pathway, no predefined posture of observation. The encounter is informal and accidental, shaped by movement through open terrain rather than guided approach. This matches the logic of the horse itself. It was never meant to be approached as an altar, it was meant to be passed. The Chabahar horse therefore belongs to the archaeology of transition rather than the archaeology of settlement. It marks the edge where land-based culture meets maritime reality. It records movement without recording names. It projects authority without recording rules. In this way, it differs fundamentally from palace reliefs of Persepolis or royal rock images of Naqshi Rostam. Those monuments announce kings. This monument announces velocity. It tells us that the people who carved it did not define their world through temples or tombs alone. They also defined it through routes, horizons, and the animals that made distance survivable. The giant rock-cut horse of Chabahar stands today as one of the most understated yet conceptually powerful monuments of the ancient Iranian world. It does not display conquest. It does not narrate myth. It does not glorify an individual ruler. It preserves the idea of movement as civilization itself. The margin between stone and sea. It fixes into permanent form the force that once allowed empires to extend beyond visible horizons, and in doing so, it reminds us that history is often carried not by walls, but by legs in motion across empty space. The giant Buddha of Ushiku, Japan. In the quiet countryside of Ibaraki Prefecture, beyond rice fields, low hills, and residential roads that give no warning of what lies ahead, a single figure rises into the sky with impossible scale. It is the Ushiku Daibutsu, one of the tallest statues ever built by human hands, standing 120 meters tall, including its lotus base, a modern monument that quietly continues a spiritual tradition over 2,000 years old. From a distance, the statue does not appear monumental at first. It appears distant, almost unreal, suspended above the horizon like a vertical mirage. Only as the road draws closer does the true scale begin to register. Cars pass beneath it like insects. Trees reach only to its ankles. Apartment blocks barely rise above the base. The Buddha does not dominate the landscape through aggression or spectacle. It simply exists at a scale that overwhelms ordinary reference. The statue was completed in 1993 and represents Amitabha, the central figure of Pure Land Buddhism, a tradition that emphasizes compassion, rebirth, and liberation through faith rather than ascetic isolation. Unlike ancient cliff Buddhas carved from living rock, Ushiku was built using modern steel frameworks and reinforced concrete, yet its purpose remains unchanged from its predecessors carved into mountains centuries earlier. It exists as a human attempt to express the immeasurable through measurable form. The head of the Ushiku Daibutsu alone is longer than a bus. One eye is nearly a meter wide. The fingers extend longer than a human body. These statistics are often shared, but they do little to communicate what the body feels when standing at the base. The scale does not impress through numbers. It unsettles through disproportionality. The human body no longer defines environment. The statue does. Yet despite its scale, the expression of the Buddha is quiet. The eyes are lowered slightly. The mouth holds no forceful smile. The face is neutral, balanced between stillness and awareness. This restraint is intentional. In Buddhist art, emotional neutrality is not emptiness. It is equilibrium. The monument is not built to demand attention. It is built to remain unaffected by it. Inside the statue, a complex interior world exists. The body contains multiple floors reached by elevator, each layer serving a symbolic function within the cosmology of Pure Land Buddhism. Visitors ascend through levels dedicated to light, meditation, remembrance, and contemplation. Thousands of small golden Buddha figures line internal walls, forming a shimmer of repeating presence that contrasts with the solitary vastness of the external form. At the heart of the statue hangs a massive bronze bell, struck only on ceremonial occasions. Its tone reverberates through the hollow interior, turning the body of the Buddha itself into a resonating chamber. Sound becomes structure. Vibration becomes devotion. What separates Ushiku from ancient colossal Buddhas in China, Sri Lanka, and Afghanistan is not scale, but intention. Ancient statues were integrated into landscapes shaped by monks, kings, and dynasties. Ushiku was built in a world of highways, zoning permits, and steel fabrication, yet its placement remains carefully chosen. It stands not in a dense urban core, but in a quiet, open region where the skyline remains low and the horizon still belongs to sky and earth rather than glass towers. The decision to build such a statue at the end of the 20th century reflected a modern anxiety as much as a spiritual aspiration. Japan at that moment was facing economic stagnation, demographic change, and cultural transition. The Ushiku Daibutsu became a response not through politics but through scale. It offered stillness in an age of acceleration. The statue's construction required decades of planning and years of coordinated work. Engineers had to calculate wind load at heights rarely attempted for freestanding religious figures. Typhoons regularly sweep the region. Earthquakes are routine. The structure had to survive not just time, but constant environmental stress. Beneath the robe-like surface lies a dense skeleton of steel designed to flex rather than resist. Unlike ancient stone Buddhas that endure through mass, Ushiku endures through elasticity. This marks a quiet shift in how humanity builds monuments. Stone once expressed permanence through weight. Steel now expresses endurance through motion. Still, despite the modern material logic, Ushiku speaks in the language of ancient symbolism. The lotus base raises the figure from the ground as a gesture of transcendence. The mudra of the hands expresses welcome, reassurance, and release from fear. The vertical posture aligns heaven, body, and earth into a single axis, repeating the same cosmic geometry seen in ancient Buddhist statues across Asia. In clear weather, the Buddha is visible from kilometers away. It becomes a navigation point not only for tourists, but for farmers returning at dusk, commuters passing along distant roads, and school children who grow up with it permanently in the background of daily life. Over time, it shifts from attraction to presence. It becomes part of personal geography. Yet Ushiku's meaning is layered with contradiction. It is one of the tallest statues on earth, yet it represents a philosophy that teaches the illusion of self-importance. It is made of concrete and steel, yet it symbolizes impermanence. It is open to visitors, yet its external expression remains unreachable. Inside, visitors encounter texts reminding them that even the most massive form will one day vanish. Wind, corrosion, weather, and entropy will quietly work their way into the structure just as they always have with stone. The Buddha does not deny impermanence, it demonstrates it at scale. There is also an unspoken continuity between Ushiku and the destroyed Buddhas of Bamiyan, where one culture once lost its largest standing, representations of faith through violence. Another culture responded within a generation by raising new vertical figures of stillness rather than dominance. The world removed a giant. The world raised another, not to replace history, but to continue its dialogue. Unlike ancient Buddhas that rose above pilgrims moving on foot or by boat, Ushiku rises above vehicles moving at speed. The perception of scale unfolds differently. The statue expands and contracts within the windshield frame as the highway curves. This constant visual recalibration mirrors the instability of modern perception itself. But when one finally exits the roadway and stands beneath the statue, motion stops. Sound dulls. The immense surface blocks wind. The vertical field of view collapses inward towards stillness. It is here, at ground level, that Ushiku most closely resembles its ancient predecessors, carved into cliff faces and canyon walls. The difference between modern and ancient melts away in the presence of scale. Children look up and fall silent. Adults misjudge distance. Cameras fail to frame the full body. The statue resists being fully captured. It requires the body to rotate, the neck to arch, the breath to pause. Though Ushiku is young compared to ancient world monuments, its purpose already feels old. It exists not to celebrate innovation, but to contradict the urgency of the era that produced it. It introduces vertical patience into a horizontal world. The giant Buddha of Ushiku shows that humanity has not abandoned its need to materialize the immeasurable. Even in an age of satellites and skyscrapers, the ancient impulse returns, to shape stillness at scale, to place awareness above horizons, to remind moving lives that something unmoving still stands. It is not carved from mountain like the Buddhas of China and Sri Lanka. It is assembled from thousands of modern components. Yet once assembled, it performs exactly the same function as its stone ancestors. It waits, not for worship alone, not for tourism alone, but for the quiet human instinct to look up when the world becomes too loud. And in that instinct, Ushiku is not modern at all. It is ancient. The giant stone warrior of Capistrano, Italy. In the rolling limestone hills of central Italy, far from the marble forums and imperial columns that later defined Roman power, a single stone figure emerged from the soil in the 20th century that forced historians to reconsider what ancient Italy looked like before Rome existed. This figure is known today as the Warrior of Capistrano, a 6-foot-tall stone warrior carved more than 2,500 years ago, standing in full ceremonial armour, preserved in silence for millennia beneath farmland near the village of Capistrano. The The statue was discovered in 1934 by a local farmer while ploughing his field. At first glance, it appeared to be just another piece of broken stone. Only when more of the sculpture was revealed did the full form begin to appear. A human figure standing upright, rigid and frontal, wearing elaborate armour and a massive disc-shaped headdress unlike anything seen in later Roman art. The discovery was immediate proof that advanced warrior cultures existed in Italy long before Rome became a city of empire. The statue represents a warrior from the ancient Italic tribes of the Abruzzo region, most likely the Vestini people, who lived in fortified hill settlements and controlled mountain passes between the Adriatic coast and the inland valleys. These societies had no written literature of their own that survived, no imperial propaganda, no marble forums. What they left behind instead were objects of function and identity, weapons, tombs, and in one extraordinary case, a warrior carved directly into stone at full human scale. The warrior of Capistrano is not carved as a generic soldier. He is presented as a named individual. An inscription carved into the stone identifies him as Nevio Pompoladio, a local elite figure whose authority was important enough to be fixed permanently into the ground. This makes the statue not just a symbol of war, but a personal declaration of status, memory, and lineage. The figure stands upright with arms bent at the elbows and hands once gripping weapons now lost. He wears a heavy breastplate decorated with geometric patterns. A wide belt secures the armour at the waist. His legs are protected by greaves that flare at the knees. Across the torso, carved lines indicate layered armour construction rather than simple decoration. Every surface communicates function, not ornament. The most striking feature is the massive circular headdress that rises above the head like a stone halo. This disc is not decorative fantasy. It likely represents a real type of ceremonial helmet or solar symbol head protection worn by elite warriors in pre-Roman Italy. Its exaggerated scale signals rank immediately. No ordinary fighter would have worn such equipment. This was a leader, a figure of command. Unlike later classical sculpture that emphasizes anatomy and motion, the warrior of Capistrano is rigid, frontal, and deliberately static. The body does not twist. The legs do not stride. The face does not express emotion. This is not a moment captured in action. This is identity frozen for eternity. The statue does not depict what the warrior did. It defines who he was. The stone used for the statue was quarried locally, carried to the burial zone, and carved using iron tools. This alone reveals a highly coordinated society. Quarrying, transport, carving, and ceremonial placement required organisation, authority, and skilled labour. These were not scattered hill tribes living in isolation. These were structured communities with leadership, trade networks, and shared symbolic language. The statue was found standing near a burial area, indicating that it most likely marked the tomb of the warrior himself or an associated elite figure. Unlike Roman tombs that later emphasized architecture and inscriptions, this early Italic culture used full human likeness carved into stone to preserve memory. The warrior did not disappear into the earth. He remained standing at its surface. The armour shown on the statue corresponds to weapon finds from local tombs. Spears, daggers, and shields, characteristic of central Italian warfare in the 6th century BCE. This places the statue at roughly the same time Rome was still a small settlement of huts along the Tiber. While future Romans were laying mud brick walls, the people of Abruzzo were already carving permanent stone identities into their land. The statue's survival is largely due to its burial. At some point after its original installation, the warrior fell or was deliberately lowered and gradually covered by soil through natural sediment movement. This removed it from sight during the era when Roman influence expanded and consumed the surrounding regions. When Roman culture eventually absorbed these tribes, their stone warrior no longer stood as a competing identity in the landscape. It slept beneath the plough instead. What makes the warrior of Capistrano so significant is not just its age, but its psychological presence. Standing before it today, One does not feel the theatrical drama of Greek sculpture or the polished authority of Roman emperors. One feels confrontation. The warrior stands at exactly human height. He does not tower over the viewer like a god, and he does not shrink into abstraction. He meets the observer eye to eye across 2.5 millennia. The face is schematic rather than naturalistic. Eyes are almond-shaped. The nose is straight and heavy. The mouth is neutral. There is no fear, no aggression, no warmth. This neutrality is intentional. The statue was never meant to portray emotion. It was meant to portray permanence. Unlike later Roman statues that celebrated living rulers in city squares, this warrior existed primarily within a funerary and territorial context. He did not seek crowds. He defined ground. His presence marked land, lineage, and authority simultaneously. The carving technique shows precision but not polish. Tool marks remain visible. On the surface, edges are sharp but not smooth to illusion. This gives the warrior a raw, grounded realism that contrasts sharply with the idealized perfection of later classical art. The figure does not attempt to transcend reality. It anchors itself deeper into it. When the statue was uncovered, early Italian archaeologists immediately recognized that it belonged to a cultural world that predated Rome's dominance. This realization forced a shift in how early Italian history was understood. Rome was not born into emptiness. It rose among multiple strong regional cultures that already possessed warfare traditions, hierarchies, and monumental identity expressions. The warrior of Capistrano represents one of those worlds that Rome would later absorb and overwrite. Languages vanished, tribal names faded, political autonomy disappeared, but this one stone figure did not follow them into silence. Today the statue stands preserved in a museum, removed from its original burial landscape but no longer hidden. It now speaks not only for one warrior, but for entire cultures reduced to footnotes in Roman history. The posture remains unchanged. The stance is still rigid. The headdress still expands above the skull like a fixed halo of rank. The armour still weighs upon the torso in stone. Nothing about the figure reacts to modern presence. It does not adapt. It does not age in expression. It does not participate in nostalgia. It simply persists. What we see in the warrior of Capistrano is an early European understanding of power that differs sharply from later imperial imagery. There is no triumph scene, no defeated enemies, no divine blessing carved overhead. Authority is presented as self-contained. It requires no audience. The statue does not tell us how Nevio Pompiliedo ruled. It does not tell us how he fought. It only tells us that he existed strongly enough, publicly enough, to be carved into the world in full size. Long before marble emperors, before bronze generals, before imperial equestrian monuments, this stone warrior stood in the soil of Italy and announced a simpler message. A human once had power here. This land belonged to someone. Memory was meant to remain. And in that sense, the warrior of Capistrano is not only a relic of a vanished tribe, it is one of the earliest surviving declarations of political identity carved at full human scale in Europe. It does not whisper. It does not perform. It stands. The Phra, Thailand, high on a wind-carved sandstone plateau in northeastern Thailand, far from the country's river cities and glowing temple corridors, lies a landscape shaped not by kings or armies, but by erosion, silence, and belief layered slowly over thousands of years. This place is known today as Phra Historical Park, a forested tableland filled with naturally sculpted stone formations, ancient cave shrines, prehistoric paintings, and among them a hidden mountain-carved Buddha whose presence feels less like a monument and more like a discovery waiting to happen by accident. The plateau itself looks unreal at first sight. Towering mushroom-shaped rocks rise from the ground as if arranged deliberately. Narrow corridors cut through stone walls shaped by wind and rain. Caverns open suddenly beneath overhangs that seem impossible to balance. Long before Buddhism ever arrived here, this landscape was already perceived as sacred because it did not behave like ordinary land. Gravity feels uncertain. Orientation shifts. Sound carries strangely. It is the kind of place ancient people did not need to explain before they respected it. Archaeological evidence shows that humans used this plateau continuously for at least 3,000 years. Prehistoric handprints, animal figures, and symbolic markings still remain on cave ceilings and hidden walls. These early communities did not carve the rocks. They understood them as already complete. The stone itself became shelter, marker, and spiritual boundary without modification. Centuries later, when Buddhism slowly spread through the Mekong Basin and into the uplands of what is now northeastern Thailand, monks and local believers encountered this plateau and recognized instantly what earlier cultures had already known. This was not an empty place. This was a place that already carried power. Instead of constructing large brick temples as they did in river cities, they adapted what already existed. It is within this tradition of adaptation rather than construction that the giant Buddha of Phu Phrabat was formed. Unlike the cliff Buddhas of China or the rock-cut giants of Sri Lanka, this Buddha is not carved as a freestanding figure exposed to wide open space. It is partially shaped from a natural stone pillar and partially reinforced through carving so subtle that it becomes difficult to tell where geology ends and human intervention begins. The Buddha occupies a standing posture beneath a massive stone overhang, protected from full sun and rain, turned slightly toward a natural processional pathway through the rocks. Its scale is deceptive. There is no open courtyard to measure it against. Trees crowd around it. Stone presses in from all sides. Only when a person steps close does the height begin to register. The body rises well above head level. The face looks down gently, not with command, but with quiet awareness. This is not a Buddha meant to dominate a city skyline. This is a Buddha meant to be encountered slowly, face to face, after walking into the forest. The carving itself reflects this intention. The lines of the robe follow the natural vertical grooves of the sandstone rather than fighting them. The arms descend along the sides where the rock already narrowed. The proportions are correct, but never theatrical. Nothing about the figure feels forced. The Buddha seems to have emerged as much through erosion as through deliberate carving. Unlike royal-sponsored monuments, there are no inscriptions announcing a king. No donor names remain. No exact date is preserved. Based on stylistic parallels and the pattern of Buddhist expansion in the region, archaeologists generally place the carving between the 10th and 13th centuries during the period of Dvaravati and early Lao cultural influence across the Korat Plateau. Yet the Buddha itself refuses to be pinned to a specific political era. It belongs instead to the rhythm of long-term religious continuity. Phu Phrabat's role during this time was not that of a city. It was a retreat zone, a pilgrimage plateau, and a monastic refuge suspended between villages rather than rooted within them. Monks travelled here to meditate within caves already sanctified by prehistoric use. Local communities climbed the plateau during seasonal festivals and periods of crisis rather than maintaining constant occupation. The giant Buddha functioned as an anchor within this moving spiritual landscape. It provided orientation. It provided focus. It gave visible form to belief in a place where everything else remained ambiguous. Unlike urban temple Buddhas surrounded by walls, bells, and rules of entry, this Buddha has no formal boundary. There is no gate. There is no line dividing sacred from ordinary ground. The transition happens simply through walking. One moves from forest shadow into stone shadow, from open plateau into enclosed overhang. The change feels atmospheric rather than architectural. This approach mirrors early Southeast Asian Buddhism, where community worship flowed naturally through landscape rather than being confined to monumental complexes alone. The Buddha was not separated from cliffs, trees, or soil. It shared the same weather, insects, darkness, and light. Because of this, the statue never became a political object. It was not protected by armies. It was not carried off as war booty. It was too integrated into the environment to be easily claimed by shifting powers. As kingdoms rose and fell across the region, Puf Rabat remained peripheral to conflict while central to belief. Over centuries, the forest thickened around the plateau. Pathways shifted. Some shrines were forgotten, others were rediscovered by wandering monks. The giant Buddha passed through periods of daily visitation and long periods of near total abandonment. Erosion continued its slow work. Rain softened facial features. Lichen darkened the lower robe. Wind rounded edges. Yet the posture remained. The calm geometry of standing awareness remained untouched. What makes this Buddha especially powerful is not size alone, it is continuity. The same figure has witnessed prehistoric ritual, early Buddhist migration, medieval pilgrimage, colonial surveys, modern archaeological documentation, and contemporary tourism without ever changing its role. It stands not as a frozen artifact, but as a live participant in the spiritual ecology of the plateau. There is also a silence here that differs from urban temples. No constant chant echoes. No bells ring on schedule. The soundscape is shaped by wind in leaves, insect movement, and distant bird calls. The Buddha does not replace the forest. It listens inside it. Modern visitors often arrive through marked park trails, but even now the first encounter rarely feels staged. The forest still controls visibility. The statue reveals itself gradually. Shadows shift across the face before the full figure appears. Many people stop without speaking when they first recognize it, not because they are instructed to be silent, but because the setting naturally compresses sound. This effect reflects the deeper role the Buddha plays here. It is not a destination built to impress. It is a presence built to be discovered. Puf Rabat as a whole shows how sacred space in ancient Southeast Asia often evolved without central planning. Prehistoric people identified powerful landscapes through instinct. Later cultures layered new meaning on top without erasing earlier ones. The giant Buddha does not replace the handprints in the caves. It occupies the same system of respect. This layered continuity is rare in monumental archaeology. Most famous statues stand in places that were cleared, refounded, or redefined by new powers. Puf Rabat instead absorbed belief without dismantling earlier perception. The giant Buddha remains today, not because it was the grandest, but because it was the most compatible with the land itself. In the modern era, roads now reach the plateau, survey maps exist, archaeological signage labels shrines. Tourists arrive with cameras, yet the core experience has not changed. The forest still controls light. The stone still defines movement. The Buddha still occupies shadow rather than spotlight. When one stands beneath the overhang and looks up at the face, there is no sense of confrontation. There is no intimidation through scale. There is only the awareness of standing before something that was never built to compete with history, yet survived it effortlessly. The giant Buddha of Puf Rabat does not command from a pedestal. It waits where geology and belief intersect quietly. It belongs to stone as much as to faith, and in that balance lies its endurance. The giant stone heads of Veracruz, Mexico. Along the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, where rivers branch into wide floodplains and tropical forests grow dense enough to swallow entire settlements in a single season, enormous stone faces began to emerge from the soil during the early years of the 20th century. At first they appeared as rounded boulders, half buried and eroded, mistaken for natural formations by farmers and road crews. Only when workers cleared away enough earth to expose eyes, noses, and lips did it become clear that these were not ordinary stones. They were carved human heads weighing tens of tons, shaped with deliberate precision, and positioned in places where no written history could explain their presence. These monuments are now commonly grouped under the term colossal stone heads, most often associated with the Olmec civilization. But along the coastal and riverine regions of Veracruz, archaeologists have identified a number of massive heads whose style, placement, and archaeological context suggest origin from local cultures that existed alongside or after the Olmecs, not necessarily from the Olmec heartland itself. This distinction matters because it opens the possibility that more than one civilization along the Gulf Coast developed the ability and the tradition of carving human faces at monumental scale. The stone used for these heads is basalt, a volcanic rock found in the distant Tuxtla Mountains, more than 100 kilometers from many of the discovery sites. Basalt is dense, heavy, and extremely difficult to carve using stone tools alone. Each head can weigh anywhere between 10 and 50 tons. Transporting a single block across rivers, swamps, and unstable ground without metal tools, draft animals, or wheeled vehicles represents one of the most complex logistical operations attempted in the ancient Americas. The faces themselves are not generic. Every head shows a different individual. Facial proportions vary. Some have flattened noses, some show deeper set eyes, some carry subtle asymmetries that suggest portraiture rather than symbolic representation. The mouths are slightly downturned, not smiling, not expressive, but controlled. The gaze is forward and steady. They do not watch the sky. They watch the world at human height. Each head also wears a distinct helmet-like headdress. These are not crowns. They resemble padded protective gear, possibly used in ritual ball games or in ceremonial combat. The variation in these helmets suggests personal identity rather than uniform ranking. If these are rulers, they were not anonymous kings. If they are warriors, they were not masked soldiers. If they are ball players, they were not minor participants. Each face was meant to be remembered individually. The earliest known stone heads in the Gulf region date to around 1200 BCE, placing them among the oldest known monumental stone sculptures in the Americas. This is long before the Maya, the Zapotecs, or the Aztecs reached prominence. This was a time when writing had barely emerged in the region, and when most societies were still transitioning from village-based life into early city-states. What makes the Veracruz heads particularly puzzling is that some of them are found far outside the primary Olmec core zones of San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes. Their archaeological layers suggest either local production by independent Gulf Coast cultures influenced by Olmec traditions, or direct movement of Olmec-style monuments into regions governed by different groups. In either scenario, the heads demonstrate that monumental stone portraiture was not isolated to a single political centre. Unlike temples or pyramids, these heads served no obvious architectural function. They do not support roofs. They are not integrated into building foundations. They are freestanding presences. Their only structural role is psychological. To stand before one of these heads is to encounter scale without vertical intimidation. They are large, but not towering. They confront you at eye level. The power they communicate is immediate and personal. This is not the authority of gods in the sky. This is the authority of humans who once controlled land, labour, and ritual. The process of carving one of these heads likely began with quarrying deep within the Tuxtla mountain range. Workers would have detached massive basalt boulders using hammerstones and controlled fracturing. The initial shaping probably took place near the quarry to reduce transport weight. Once roughed into head form, the stone would be dragged overland on sleds of timber, pulled by coordinated teams across mudflats, riverbanks, and forest floor. Rivers likely played a crucial role in transport. During the rainy season, swollen waterways could float heavy rafts carrying these massive stones downstream towards settlement zones. Even with waterways, the operation would have required months of labour, coordinated leadership, and large populations mobilised for non-agricultural work. These heads are therefore not just sculptures. They are evidence of social organisation at very high levels. Once delivered to their final sites, the heads were refined using repeated hammering and grinding with harder stones. The finish is smooth, but not polished. Tool marks are still visible under close inspection. This confirms that the artisans worked slowly, shaping by incremental removal rather than cutting clean lines. Faces emerged over long periods of labour, not in sudden artistic gestures. Many of the heads show signs of being recarved. Ears are sometimes removed, cheek lines altered, helmets reshaped. This suggests that older monuments were sometimes repurposed to represent new individuals. Basalt was too valuable to discard. Memory itself was reshaped. The locations where the heads are found also matter. Some appear near ceremonial platforms. Others rest beside ancient roadways. A few were buried, deliberately in ritual deposits, face down or on their sides. This pattern suggests that the heads were not static guardians. They moved through social cycles. They were displayed, retired, altered, and sometimes ritually decommissioned. There are no surviving inscriptions on any of the heads. We do not know their names. We do not know their titles. We do not know what deeds they performed. All that remains is face, scale, and silence. This silence is part of what gives the heads their enduring psychological effect. Without text to explain them, every viewer is forced into direct confrontation with presence alone. There is no story to follow. There is only encounter. The Veracruz heads also challenge older ideas that the Olmecs were the sole mother culture of Mesoamerica. If regional Gulf Coast groups were also producing or modifying these colossal portraits, then early Mesoamerican civilization was more distributed and interconnected than once believed. Power did not radiate from a single center. It flowed along rivers, coastlines, and trade routes. In the tropical environment of Veracruz, stone survives while organic architecture disappears almost completely. Houses built from wood, thatch, and earth dissolve within centuries. Only stone remains. This gives monuments like the colossal heads disproportionate archaeological visibility. They appear larger in history than they may have felt in daily life, simply because everything else vanished. Yet even if they once stood among bustling market plazas and crowded ceremonial grounds, their scale would still have marked them as extraordinary. They were never background objects. They were always focal points. Standing beside a head today, one becomes aware that the surface you are seeing was once struck by human hands tens of thousands of times. Every curve required effort. Every edge required decision. Every facial proportion required intention. These are not accidental outcomes of erosion. They are portraits assembled through exhaustion. Unlike many ancient monuments, the Veracruz heads were not rediscovered through grand expeditions. They emerged quietly, from road cuts, from sugarcane fields, from riverbanks collapsing under seasonal flood. Local people often encountered them first, not foreign scientists. In many cases, villagers lived beside them for years before archaeologists arrived to document them formally. Today, several of the heads are preserved in museums or protected parks. Others remain near their original find spots. They no longer rule territory. They no longer anchor ritual. But they still define space through presence. Crowds gather around them instinctively. Children circle their bases. Visitors lower their voices without being instructed. The unknown culture or cultures behind the Veracruz heads left no libraries. They left no records of their wars. They left no chronicles of their rulers. But they left faces. Faces larger than life. Faces shaped from volcanic stone. Faces that outlasted cities. The giant stone heads of Veracruz do not belong entirely to the Olmec world, and they do not belong entirely to any later civilization either. They exist in the space between names, between timelines, between disciplines. They remind us that identity does not always survive in language. Sometimes it survives only in form, and sometimes form is enough.